Operation Michael was a major German military offensive during the First World War that began the Spring Offensive on the 21st of March 1918. It was launched for the Hindenburg Line in the vicinity of Saint-Quentin, France. Its goal was to break through the Allied lines and advance in a northwesterly direction to seize the Channel ports, which supplied the British Expeditionary Force, and to drive the BEF into the sea. 2 days later, General Ludendorff, the chief of the German General Staff, changed his plan and pushed for an offensive due west, along the whole of the British front north of the River Somme. This was designed to separate the French and British armies and crush the British forces by pushing them into the sea. The offensive ended at Villers-Bretonneux, to the east of the Allied communications centre at Amiens, where the Allies managed to halt the German advance. The German armies had suffered many casualties and were unable to maintain supplies to the advancing troops. Much of the ground fought over was the wilderness left by the Battle of the Somme in 1916. The action was therefore officially named by the British Battles Nomenclature Committee as the First Battles of the Somme, 1918, whilst the French call it the Second Battle of Picardy. The failure of the offensive marked the beginning of the end of the First World War for Germany. The arrival in France of large reinforcements from the United States replaced Entente casualties, but the German army was unable to recover from its losses before these reinforcements took the field. Operation Michael failed to achieve its objectives, and the German advance was reversed during the Second Battle of the Somme, 1918, in the Allied 100 Days Offensive. Background: strategic developments. On the 11th of November 1917, the German High Command discussed what they hoped would be a decisive offensive on the Western Front the following spring. The target was the British Expeditionary Force, commanded by Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, which they believed had been exhausted by the battles in 1917 at Arras, Messines, Passchendaele and Cambrai. A decision to attack was taken by General Ludendorff on the 21st of January 1918. At the start of 1918, the German people were close to starvation and growing tired of the war. By mid-February 1918, Ludendorff had moved nearly 50 divisions from the east following the Russian surrender and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which outnumbered the Allied armies on the Western Front. Germany had 192 divisions and 3 brigades on the Western Front by the 21st of March, out of 241 in the German army. Of these divisions, 110 were in the front line, 50 of which faced the shorter British front. Another 67 divisions were in reserve, with 31 facing the BEF. By May 1918, 318,000 American soldiers were due in France, with another million planned to arrive before August. The Germans knew that the only chance of victory was to defeat the Allies before the build-up of the American Expeditionary Force was complete. The German strategy for the 1918 Spring Offensive at Eisenschlacht involved 4 offensives: Michael, Georgette, Gneisenau and Blucher. York. Michael took place on the Somme, and then Georgette was conducted on the Lys and Ypres, which was planned to confuse the enemy. Blucher took place against the French in the Champagne region. Although British intelligence knew that a German offensive was being prepared, this far-reaching plan was much more ambitious than Allied commanders expected. Ludendorff aimed to advance across the Somme, then wheel northwest to cut the British lines of communication behind the Artois front, trapping the BEF in Flanders. Allied forces would be drawn away from the Channel ports, which were essential for British supply. The Germans could then attack these ports and other lines of communication. The British would be surrounded and surrender. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, had agreed that the BEF would take over more of the front line at the Boulogne Conference, against military advice, after which the British line was extended. The line, taken over from the French, barely existed, needing much work to make it easily defensible to the positions further north, which slowed progress in the area of the Fifth Army. During the winter of 1917–1918, the new British line was established in an arc around Saint-Quentin, by many small unit actions among the ruined villages in the area. There were many isolated outposts, gaps in the line, and large areas of disputed territory and wasteland. These positions were slowly improved by building the new three-zone system of defense in depth, but much of the work was performed by infantry working parties. Most of the redoubts in the battle zone were complete by March 1918, but the rear zone was still under construction. The BEF had been reorganized due to a lack of infantry replacements. Divisions were reduced from 12 to 9 battalions, on the model established by the German and French armies earlier in the war. It was laid down that the senior regular and first-line territorial battalions were to be retained, in preference to the higher-numbered second-line territorial and New Army battalions. Second-line territorial and New Army divisions were badly disrupted, having in some cases to disband half of the battalions, to make way for units transferred from regular or first-line territorial divisions. Battalions had an establishment of 1,000 men, but some had fewer than 500 men, due to casualties and sickness during the winter. Tactical developments. The German army trained using open warfare tactics which had proved effective on the Eastern Front, particularly at the Battle of Riga in 1917. The Germans had developed storm troop units, elite infantry which used infiltration tactics, operating in small groups that advance quickly by exploiting gaps and weak defenses. Stoßtruppen bypass defended areas, which follow-up infantry units could deal with once they were isolated and occupied territory rapidly. To disrupt communication by attacking enemy headquarters, artillery units and supply depots in the rear. Each division transferred its best and fittest soldiers into storm units, from which several new divisions were formed. This process gave the German army an initial advantage in the attack, but meant that the best troops would suffer disproportionate casualties, while the quality of the men in reserve declined. Developments in artillery tactics were far more influential than infantry infiltration tactics. Ludendorff was able to dispense with slow, destructive and wire-cutting bombardments by using the large number of artillery pieces and mortars to fire hurricane bombardments concentrated on artillery and machine gun positions, headquarters, telephone exchanges, railways and communication centers. There were 3 phases to the bombardment: a brief fire on command and communications, then a destructive counter-battery bombardment, and then bombardment of front-line positions. The deep bombardment aimed to knock out the opponent's ability to respond. It lasted only a few hours to retain surprise, before the infantry attacked behind a creeping barrage. Such artillery tactics had been made possible by the vast numbers of accurate heavy guns and large stocks of ammunition that Germany had deployed on the Western Front by 1918. An officer of the 51st Division wrote, "The year 1917 closed in an atmosphere of depression. Most divisions on the Western Front had been engaged continuously in offensive operations. All were exhausted and weakened. The last German offensive on the Western Front, before the Cambrai-Gegenschlag of December 1917, had been against the French at Verdun, giving the British commanders little experience in defense. The development of a deep defense system of zones and trench lines by the Germans during 1917 had led the British to adopt a similar system of defense in depth. This reduced the proportion of troops in the front line, which was likely held by snipers, patrols and machine gun posts, and concentrated reserves and supply dumps to the rear, away from German artillery. British divisions arranged the 9 infantry battalions in the forward and battle zones according to local conditions and the views of commanders. About 1/3 of the infantry battalions of the 5th Army and a similar number in the 3rd Army held the forward zone. The forward zone was organized in 3 lines to a depth depending on the local terrain. The first 2 lines were not held continuously, particularly in the 5th Army area, where they were in isolated outpost groups in front of an irregular line of supporting posts. The 3rd line was a series of small redoubts for 2 or 4 platoons. Posts and redoubts were sited so that intervening ground could be swept by machine gun and rifle fire from machine guns adjacent to the redoubts. Defense of the forward zone depended on firepower rather than large numbers of troops, but in the 5th Army area a lack of troops meant that the zone was too weak to be able to repulse a large attack. The battle zone was also usually organized in 3 defensive systems: front, intermediate and rear, connected by communication trenches and switch lines, with the defenders concentrated in centers of resistance rather than in continuous lines. About 36 of the 110 infantry and pioneer battalions of the 5th Army held the forward zone. Artillery, trench mortars and machine guns were also arranged in depth, in positions chosen to allow counter-battery fire, harassing fire on transport routes, fire on assembly trenches, and to be able to fire barrages along the front of the British positions at the first sign of attack. Artillery positions were also chosen to offer cover and concealment, with alternative positions on the flanks and to the rear. About 2/3 of the artillery was in the battle zone, with a few guns further forward, and some batteries were concealed and forbidden to fire before the German offensive began. Prelude. German offensive preparations. The Germans chose to attack the sector around Saint-Quentin, taken over by the British from February to April 1917. Following the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line, Germany had begun construction of the Siegfried's Stellung in September 1916. During the Battle of the Somme, it stretched over 500 kilometers from the Channel to the Moselle River and was built by Belgian and Russian prisoners of war. The strongest section was the salient at Saint-Quentin between Arras and Soissons. The line was 1.5 kilometers deep, with barbed wire in zigzag lines of 15 meters, protecting 3 lines of trenches, interconnecting tunnels and strong points. In the rear were deep underground bunkers known as Stollen, and artillery was hidden on reverse slopes. The Germans withdrew to this line in an operation codenamed Alberic over 5 weeks, during which time German High Command ordered a scorched earth policy. The ground abandoned in the retreat was laid waste, wells were poisoned, booby traps laid, and most towns and villages were destroyed. German plan of attack. The attacking armies were spread along a 69-kilometer front between Arras, Saint-Quentin and La Fère. Ludendorff had assembled a force of 74 divisions, 6,600 guns, 3,500 mortars and 326 fighter aircraft, divided between the 17th Army, 2nd Army of Heeresgruppe Kronprinz Ruprecht and the 18th Army, part of Heeresgruppe Deutscher Kronprinz, and the 7th Army. The main weight of attack was between Arras and a few kilometers south of Saint-Quentin, where the 18th Army had 27 divisions. 44 divisions were allocated to Operation Michael and called mobile divisions, which were brought up to full strength in manpower and equipment. Men over 35 years old were transferred, a machine gun unit, air support and a communications unit were added to each division, and the supply and medical branches were re-equipped, but a chronic shortage of horses and fodder could not be remedied. Around the new year, the mobile divisions were withdrawn for training according to der Angriff im Stellungskrieg und einige Verfügungen, die in den Erfahrungen über den Angriff ihren Niederschlag finden. Training emphasized rapid advance, the silencing of machine guns and maintaining communication with the artillery, to ensure that infantry and the creeping barrage moved together. Infantry were issued with light machine guns, mortars and rifle grenades, and intensively trained. 30 divisions were trained in the new tactics but had a lower scale of equipment than the elite divisions, and the remainder were stripped of material to supply them, giving up most of the remaining draft animals. In the north, two German armies would attack either side of the Flesquières salient, created during the Battle of Cambrai. The 18th Army, transferred from the Eastern Front, planned its attack either side of Saint-Quentin, to divide the British and French armies. The two northern armies would then attack the British position around Arras, before advancing northwest to cut off the BEF in Flanders. In the south, it was intended to reach the Somme and then hold the line of the river against any French counterattacks. The southern advance was extended to include an advance across the Somme. British defensive preparations. In the north, the Third Army defended the area from Arras south to the Flesquières salient. To the south, the Fifth Army held the line down to the junction with the French at Barézes. Byng had commanded the Canadian Corps who took Vimy Ridge at the Battle of Arras and the Battle of Cambrai, and Gough had commanded the Reserve Army, which had taken over part of the Somme battlefront in July 1916. The Fifth Army held the longest front of the BEF, with 12 divisions and 3 cavalry divisions, 1,650 guns, 119 tanks and 357 aircraft. An average British division in 1918 consisted of 11,800 men, 3,670 horses and mules, 48 artillery pieces, 36 mortars, 64 Vickers heavy machine guns, 144 Lewis light machine guns, 770 carts and wagons, 360 motorcycles and bicycles, 14 trucks, cars and 21 motorized ambulances. In the weekly intelligence summary of the 10th of March 1918, British intelligence predicted a German offensive in the Arras Saint-Quentin area based on air reconnaissance photographs and the testimony of deserters. The prediction was reiterated in the next summary on the 17th of March. Allied aircraft had photographed German preparations. New supply roads had been constructed and shell craters had been turned into concealed trench mortar batteries. Heavily laden motorized and horse-drawn transports had been seen heading into Saint-Quentin from the east, and in the distance German officers were observed studying British lines. The British replied with nightly bombardments of the German front line, rear areas and possible assembly areas. A few days before the attack, 2 German deserters slipped through no man's land and surrendered to the 107th Brigade. They spoke of troops, batteries of artillery and trench mortars massing on the German front. They reported massed trench mortars directly in front of 36th Division lines for wire cutting and an artillery bombardment lasting several hours, as a preliminary to an infantry assault. The War Diary of the 9th Battalion, Royal Irish Fusiliers describes their activities from 18 to 20 March as being intensive training during the day, with specialist training in the evening. During the night of the 20th of March, troops of the 61st Division conducted a raid on German positions and took more prisoners, who told them that the offensive would be launched the following morning. The Fifth Army defenses, which were still incomplete. The rear zone existed as outline markings only, and the battle zone consisted of battalion redoubts that were not mutually supporting and vulnerable to German troops infiltrating between them. The British ordered an intermittent bombardment of German lines and likely assembly areas at 3:30 and a gas discharge on the 61st Division front. At 4:40 a huge German barrage began along all the Fifth Army front and most of the front of the Third Army.